Well, what's the crack? It's no secret that Ireland is in a deep housing crisis. Over 350,000 adults are living at home because they cannot afford to rent or buy accommodation by themselves. Entire apartment blocks and housing estates are being bought up by Cuckoo funds who are paying zero tax. And this week in the news, we are seeing the chaos with the lack of affordable student accommodation. So I've asked Rory Hearne, who is a professor at Maynooth University, author of the famous book Housing Shock. He's a social activist and an all-round great guy to come on the channel and tell us what's going on. So before we jump into the interview, please don't forget to like the video and to subscribe to the channel, and let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So Rory, briefly explain to us how big the extent of the current housing crisis is and who are the winners in all of this.
Well, if we look at the housing crisis now, it has reached and stretched across society. It is no longer just those who are homeless, which is, horrific numbers that there are. We look at, we have over 2,500 children and their families who are homeless in this country in emergency accommodation. And that's almost been normalized. We have also, it's stretched to, in many ways, a generation, but it goes even beyond a generation of people in their 20s and 30s who are locked out of the ability to buy a home, the ability to rent an affordable home. And if we look at also figures, which I was looking at that come from the CSO, which show that we have in the region of 450,000 adults who live at home with their parents. About 350,000 of those are would be in their 30s or under. That is a shocking figure. And if we compare that, for example, that's just people who are living at home, adults living at home, to the amount, if you were to think 350,000 homes, people, you're talking about in the need of, maybe 100,000 homes needed to house those people. And our current plan to build 33,000 units a year would mean that for the next 4 years, every single unit would need to go just to those households. And that, of course, doesn't include the new households that come along. It doesn't include the renters who need affordable homes. It doesn't include those who need social housing. So the crisis, as I said, extends from those at the most extreme end who are homeless. And again, I think we need to highlight that again, that we have a major homeless crisis in this country. It should not be accepted as normal. But we also have, as I said, a generation who are renting. We now have a fifth of all households, that's 20% of households, are in the private rental sector. And the government talks about this is okay, policy has promoted this over the last few years, but the problem is, and for anyone who's been in the private rental sector in Ireland will understand this, but maybe people from abroad wouldn't understand it. The Irish rental sector is not, private rental sector is not like the European model. There's no security of tenure. People can be evicted very easily by landlords, and it's absolutely unaffordable. Rents have doubled over the last decade, like actually doubled. You're talking about rents now, 2,000 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment in Dublin, rents that people can't afford. So you have renters in generation rent who are stuck in insecure housing. As I said, you have people locked, as I call locked out completely, living at home, adults living at home. You have the homeless, you have the hidden homeless. So the scale of the crisis and housing need, I think, is way beyond what government and official statistics are putting across at the moment.
Yeah, and it's evident in what's going on. And what we're now seeing is, I saw you mention during the week, because of generation rent, we're now seeing the effects of that, in that people my age, millennials, because we're still renting, we're now locking out the students. So the effects are snowballing, if I'm reading it right. So we know the situation is quite bad. Talk me through how we've gotten here, and what are the government policies that have led us here? Are any of those policies deliberate?
Yeah, you're absolutely right to raise the issue of the student accommodation crisis, because absolutely, I was making that point that students in the past would have got private rental accommodation in the private rental sector, houses, rented houses, apartments. But as you're right, millennials are now, and even people in their 40s and 50s, and we're hearing, incredibly harrowing stories in the media at the moment from people in their 50s facing into retirement, wondering how are they going to be able to afford these rents. And they are now, people are living in the private rental sector for much, much longer. And so therefore, in the past, you would have had that housing become available for students, but that's not available now. And so that, of course, makes the crisis worse for students. And we now see this year is absolutely the worst student housing crisis we have ever seen in this country. In terms of how we have got here, there are many factors and policies and things that happened that brought us to this point. We are in a perfect storm, in a sense that, many negative things that had they happened on their own wouldn't have caused this scale of crisis. There are definitely, and I make this case, that fundamentally we are in this crisis because of policy. It is and was a deliberate decision. And while politicians and policymakers will say, they are deeply troubled by this crisis, they care about it, they care about those who are affected. If you look at the policy decisions they made them, and they could not have known that this was going to happen. And we saw, of course, the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, throw his hands up in the Dáil to say that, shocked that these investor funds bought the housing estate in Mood. Everybody knew they were going to do that. It was only a matter of time before they started bulk buying housing estates, when they can come in here, they're given a tax break, they effectively pay zero tax, and there's these massive rents that they can earn money off. So we got here as a result of policy. And essentially, I kind of make this point that I argue that the millennial generation and the generation coming behind them, and in many ways all future generations in this country, were sacrificed to protect and reboot an economy and a property system that was crashed by those privileged groups in their 50s and 60s. And the decisions, when we trace back to the decisions that were made from 2009 onwards, 2010, 11, 12, you go through the last decade, the decisions that were made were the likes of NAMA, setting it up then and encouraging it. And the former finance minister, Michael Noonan, actively encouraged NAMA to sell off its land and property to vulture funds. They brought the vulture funds and investment funds into this country. They handed our land over. I argue they handed our future over. They handed the future of Generation Rent over to these vulture funds because it was a short-term fix for them. Yeah. What they wanted to do was they wanted to get the property prices back up again. They wanted to get the rents back up again so that they could essentially save the financial institutions, save the core banks. That's what they wanted to do. It goes back to the banks. They wanted to keep the banks from completely collapsing. And what they weren't prepared to do, which I made the point back in 2014 and 2013, we had reached the low point of rents and house prices. And I made the point around then that NAMA, we were now 4 years into the crisis, that NAMA had all this land, had all these assets, had all this property. We were at a point where we could reshape our housing system. The state could play a key role in building affordable homes. And they decided not to do that. They instead decided that they would, as I said, go out to the international funds and say, Ireland is for sale. We want you to buy up all these toxic loans off our banks, off NAMA, so we can say to the global financial markets, look, we're back up and running. Ireland is back up for business, and the property prices will inflate. That will reduce the amount of toxic loans on our banks, make our banks more viable, and we'll be back in business, and we will have protected the value of the assets held by the privileged groups in Irish society in their 50s and 60s the bankers, the doctors, whoever bought their properties, that they will have been protected and the value of their property will have been protected. And basically, fuck the generations coming after them. And I think when we really look at what happened in those years, the scale of the decisions that were made and the impact on the generations coming and the availability and access to affordable housing, I think the level of treason is a word you could throw around in terms of decisions that were made that essentially sacrificed the future generations and their ability to get affordable housing was made by those governments and those politicians, and I think they should be held accountable for that.
Yeah, it was all done. It was all rushed in, and I suppose I should, full disclosure here. In my previous job was as an investment funds lawyer, setting up these funds. I was doing all the filings, setting up all these real estate funds, and I specifically remember when they brought in the IREF tax 5 or 6 years ago, and my job was to track everything Pierce Doherty said in the DAW. And now I'm on the outside, and I'm calling bullshit. Like I can just see it's all bullshit, and I feel a bit guilty. I feel a bit guilty in that I have to tell people that this is what's happened. So that's where I'm coming from. During the summer, there was an incredible moment. One of the bills was going through the Dáil, and it had been decided that Cuckoo funds would not be able to buy up housing estates, and there were certain conditions when it came to apartments. And then the night before the thing was passed, the rug was pulled and the old provisions were put back into the bill. I couldn't believe it. I made a video about it, and the whole country went mad. On reflecting on it and learning about the phrase, "You will own nothing and you will be happy," that's come out of Davos, it just seems very clear to me what's going on, that there is a bigger direction here, and it's not Micheál Martin and it's not Leo Varadkar. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that what's very clear is that for the wealthy internationally, the global 1%, or as they're referred to, but people who hold their wealth in the wealth funds, the investment funds, the Davos elite, that they clearly decided and saw that they need places to get a big return on their wealth and on their investment to increase their wealth further. And what we would call the normal economy has not provided that level of return. And they saw an opportunity now it started, it's been going on for decades and decades. The real estate industry is an industry that looks at how it can convert what we call our homes into investment assets. So they've been at that for decades and decades. And of course, Donald Trump is a famous example of this. But something went even further. I think in the mid 2000s, we had the mortgages traded everywhere in the international markets. But after the crash, what was very clear was that something profound had happened and was happening, particularly in the US, in Canada, Ireland, the UK, that there was a generation emerging who, as a result of the crash, as a result of precarious jobs, weren't going to be able to buy their own home. And investment funds looked at this and they were very clear. They saw this is our future market. If we basically tie in the future generations into renting permanently our property, our investments, we have permanent gold rush. It's permanent. They will never be able to buy their own home because our rents are so expensive. They'll never be able to save to buy a deposit to buy their own home. If we buy up enough property and if we deliver enough of the property as rental, there'll be no homes to buy. So it's very clear that the real estate investment trusts, the investment funds in property, in real estate, and they talk about this, and I've researched this and I've looked at their documents and I've trawled through them, and I did it for my book. I looked through it and researched it, and I was struck by it. Here they were saying, generation rent is our market. And we want to, as you said, ensure they can never own their own home. And the biggest challenge, and the investment fund said this in Ireland during the summer, the biggest threat to their market strategy of turning generation rent into a permanent investment for them. And of course, obviously, generation rent is going to pay that into perpetuity, was the delivery of affordable housing. That if the government built affordable housing on scale, on large numbers, that this would be a threat to their investment strategy. And of course, what have we seen? The government hasn't done that, because the government has hitched its wagon to these investment funds. And I think people need to be really, really clear and understand what's going on here, which is, this is not some temporary aberration. If we let these investment funds grow their influence, this is permanently locking out people of the ability to have affordable homes or to buy their own home.
Yeah, it's scary. And you say the government has hitched their wagon, or who's leading it? Who is making the decisions? Because it just seems that the tail is wagging the dog here at the moment. So we know all this is going on. So what do we do? What's going to happen in Ireland? It's very evident, or very likely, that Sinn Féin will get in next. What are Sinn Féin's policies around housing, and is there any chance for this to be reversed?
Yeah, I think that the next election is probably not going to be until 2024. That's when I think it's the local and European elections take place. So actually the next general election, when we would elect the next government, could be 2025. Which is, 3 or 4 years away. There's a lot of damage that could be done between now and then. So my concern actually is that now, in the next coming months and years, that we do what we can to reverse the policies that are in place. And for my position as an academic, a researcher, an activist, I want to try highlight as much as possible what's going on here and what can be done. And I think that for generation rent, for young people, for millennials, I think there's real questions about what are they going to do. And there's real possibilities. The first point is that there are alternatives to what's being done at the moment. We can still roll this back. In actual fact, if you look at Germany, for example, they are now trying to actively work to a place where they will ban investment funds, and they're going to buy back the units that have been developed by investment funds into affordable housing. So, that's not beyond the possibility at some point down the line. But obviously we want to avoid having to get to that place, because it's even more difficult then. There are solutions, and I think that the key thing that is bringing investment funds in here right now is the rents. The rents are so high, they can get such a high return that it's attracting them in. It's like honey to the bees, or shit for the flies, whatever way you want to put it. And so I think we need to reduce the rents. I think we need to freeze them, and I need to cap the new rents, because that's another issue. If an investment fund, institutional investor, develops a build to rent property at the moment, they can charge whatever rent they want on the new unit. And I think there needs to be put in place rent caps on new units, so that they're not actually allowed to basically be set whatever. And that would, I think, disencourage and disincentivize the investment funds quickly coming in here. I think we should get rid of the tax break that they have. I think they should be increased, the tax on them. And you're obviously familiar with this in terms of referring to the IRFs and the various mechanisms that they can get to reduce their taxes.
The whole, I get why funds don't pay tax, and why we have a good tax system for funds. Funds in general aren't the enemy here, because that's part of our economy, that we set up these financial service businesses. I don't know how long more it's going to last, but it's worked well for 30 years. But the problem is we're setting up, domiciling all these funds here. We should allow them go around the world, do what you want around the world, but don't come into don't shit where you eat. We're giving you all these tax breaks, but don't fuck up our place. And I think the government one of my strong things is that we have everything we need here. We have the investment funds, we have big pharma companies with big tech, and we save them billions in tax, but we don't ask for anything in return. Very generally speaking, Facebook should be building universities, pharmaceuticals, build a hospital, give them all the drugs you want, just build it. All these kind of things, leveraging on them. But that's very political stuff. But so I just wanted, I know we're running out of time. You mentioned that this, 10 years ago, this all went back to the banks, and that this created to save the banks. On my channel, I talk a lot about crypto and decentralization. I pinpoint how centralized Davy was, and the corruption that goes on there, and how it's not let fail. What are your thoughts around decentralization and that whole space generally?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to, I think, get a sense, or even see, there's obviously these alternatives happening in a way that are challenging the central institutions. And we're not quite at that point where, they're completely, challenging them. The institutions still hold the overwhelming majority of, for example, mortgages. And so I think that the real issue is, for me anyway, it's that how can we create, and I think like what you're saying there about, funds and funds aren't the enemy. And like, for me, I think we need to have an ethical economy. And that means an economy that's run according to values. And I think the problem is that values of, inclusion, of social justice, of environmental justice, don't run through businesses enough, and they should be fundamental. And I think that there's a real need for all of our institutions. That includes businesses, it includes banks, it includes our government, to actually set out and say, okay, what values are we running according to? And I think for a lot of people, regardless of whether they consider themselves on the left or the right or wherever, they do agree on values. And they agree that, we should have a system that protects people, and that protects families, and that protects individuals, and doesn't leave them in absolute hardship. But yet that's what we have at the moment, and doesn't lead to the inequality that we have now. And is a dysfunction at the heart of our centralized systems at the moment, that is clearly leading people to push and create alternatives. And what I hope is that the alternatives that are created can be disruptive, absolutely. But I hope that the values that are promoted are ones, as I said there, of inclusion, of helping everybody up, and aren't further down the road of the individualization, and people just have to watch out for themselves. And so I think there's a real challenge in that. How do we create alternatives that promote those values, that help us better cohere as a society? Because at the moment, our institutions and our banks and doesn't work for everybody. They absolutely work mostly for a small elite. They benefit them the most. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and in trying to create what you're saying, it's like the old Warren Buffett thing. I think he has a line that says, show me the incentive and I'll show you the value. So until you start incentivizing these types of things, you won't get any results. And at the moment, you see the ESG stuff, that's just greenwashing. I don't read too much into it. So I'll just finish up with two more questions, if that's okay. One would be, my second last question is what would your advice to young people be right now, whether it's the students or that, is it emigrate?
Yeah, I've been asked about this over the last while. It is my biggest fear that young people in this country emigrate as a response to this crisis. I think that for me, that's heartbreaking. I have children. I don't want them to emigrate. I see what immigration has done to this country down the decades. We've lost talent, we've lost, our culture, we've lost, youth is the impetus for change. And in many ways, I think maybe that's why. And we know that historically in Ireland, immigration has been the political pressure valve. It releases any sense of real drive for change. And I do believe the political class in Ireland absolutely accepts and favors a certain amount of emigration of young people, particularly the angsty ones who might make a bit of noise and challenge things. So my plea to the younger generations is, do not emigrate. Please stay and change this country. This country needs you to absolutely stay and reshape it. And I believe it can be. If we look at marriage equality, we look at repeal referendum, we look at the conversations around mental health. Young people in Ireland have completely different values. They are open, they're inclusive, they question, they are so beautiful in comparison to the fucking conservative, inward looking, passive acceptance that existed in previous generations that tolerated such oppression and abuse. We have generation who have driven massive social change. Now we need to change it, bring it into the economy. And that is where the real challenge is. Bring it into the economy and create a social economy that's built around the values you want to see. And that fundamentally does come down to housing. So I would think people should stay and fight for the country you want to see. And I think we could do that.
And that's an excellent answer. And it leads me into my final question, in that you are a very vocal figure and very popular figure amongst, on Twitter, in all the spaces that young people get their news from and things like that. And I think young people look up to you as a voice. Do you think that the young people could actually change things politically with the setup of a new organized party or something like that? And would that be something you'd like to see and join?
Yeah, I think that young people absolutely could change the shape of what's going on at the moment politically. When I quoted those figures to you, you probably have in the region, as I was saying, of 350,000 people between the age of 18 and 30, I think it is. That is a massive voting block. That is just, that would swing the next election will hang. If all those young people were registered and went out to vote, that would absolutely determine. And they voted as a block and, cohered where they went to. That would absolutely determine the outcome of the next election. So young people have that potential power. The question is, as you say, how do they exercise it? Do they exercise it? And I think absolutely. If young people want to go form a new political party or based around, the generation that's been locked out and that would ideally be espousing those values I talked about, those progressive, inclusive values, absolutely. I think that would be a great thing to happen. I think that there are other political parties, you mentioned Sinn Féin, the Social Democrats there as well. There's People Before Profit, there's the Greens, there's other parties there that, are alternatives and are trying to advocate alternatives around those values as well. And I think that what's most important, I think, is that young people register to vote and that they start getting organized and raising their voice saying that they're going to vote and that whatever government is in power at the next election, that they are going to influence that. And I think it is about young people getting active, getting involved in politics, going on to the media, talking to their family, talking to their community, because this isn't, this change won't happen unless young people get active and do that. And I think there's lots of ways they can, as I've said there, they can protest, they can, as I say, get onto the media, they can talk about their stories, they can, really communicate it. And, I hope that's what happens. And, for me, that is the hope.
That's excellent. Rory, thanks a million for taking the time. I'd love if you came back on in a couple of months or when things get heated again. But I value your time a lot. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me know in the comment section below your thoughts on this interview, as I hope to do a follow-up video very soon. And don't forget to like the video and to subscribe to the channel.